it's a great pleasure to welcome Ibrahim Callan, Professor Ibrahim Callan. I've known Ibrahim for a number of years, and not only is he one of the most leading thinkers on this whole issue of civilization and the risks of the clash rather than cooperation between civilizations, but he's also someone who, not to use a phrase that's often overused, but relevant in this situation, who walks the talk, who actually engages in real cross-civilizational dialogues, who tries to promote understanding. And I think we will have a rich sharing this afternoon. And with that, may I hand over to Dr. Abdullah Falik, who will also welcome you on behalf of the Center of British-Turkish Understanding.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for moderating this afternoon's webinar by the Center for British-Turkish Understanding. It's really an honor to be talking with the likes of Professor Ibrahim Callan today. I'd like to also thank all our participants, all our guests, over 300 registered. We already have about nearly 150 online. So we hope this afternoon's webinar will be very interesting and a fruitful discussion. Above all, I'd like to thank Professor Ibrahim Callan for joining us and gracing us today to this auspicious occasion of the launch of the Center for British-Turkish Understanding. Professor Ibrahim needs no introduction. I'm sure Oliver will say a few more words afterwards, but for him to be talking to us today for the launch of the center, we are very, very grateful and we're thankful to him. Today is also a special day. Just want to dwell a little bit because Fridays are usually a day of celebration in the week of the Muslim week. And this is probably the last day of fasting for Muslims who are fasting around the world. And this weekend could be Eid, could be tomorrow. We don't know. But this is all happening under lockdown for Muslims across the world. And it's the same for other faith communities who are trying to innovate, trying to come up with new ideas, thinking outside the box of how to lead their normal lives as best as they can, but at the same time be truthful to their faith. So it's quite interesting times we're passing by. But with the COVID-19 and the virus that is affecting communities across the world, I personally feel there is a sense of togetherness, people coming together, of sharing, of unity, of looking after one another. And this has been brought up by the virus, because the virus affects everyone irrespective of background, creed, or color. But at the same time, sadly, we see some incidents of some people in the media, within some groups, who are trying to create divisions between communities. So this is happening at the same time. So this afternoon's seminar or webinar is to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on civilizations. Is it promoting more clash, or are we looking at more cooperation? So inshallah, and hopefully today we'll hear from Professor Ibrahim Callan, a world scholar who will elaborate a bit more on the topic, and we will benefit from that. Just a few words about the Center for British-Turkish Understanding. This is our first event. We're very new, and we are grateful that so many people have responded to our invitation to join the webinar today. The idea of the center is to really promote and foster better relations between Britain and Turkey. And we have long relations for, anyway, but at times of difficulty and crisis, we often see there is misinformation that abounds. Recently, you saw the issue of the PPE from Turkey that was sent to the UK, but the Turkish government got blamed for it when it had nothing to do with the Turkish government. So this kind of misinformation that is around, and also Islamophobia, Turkophobia. So we will try to address some of these issues through the center, through discussion, debate, and research. So this is the idea of the center of CBTU. And we hope, today's discussion will also be a step in that direction where we can learn from each other and the experience from around the world. Finally, we hope that everyone joining us today, you'll be able to talk to us, give us ideas, send us your ideas, look out for collaboration that we can work together in the future and support this important initiative. So without taking further time, I'll pass back to Oliver to introduce our main speaker for the evening, Professor Ibrahim Callan. And finally, whenever you celebrate Eid this weekend, tomorrow or Sunday or Monday, Eid Mubarak to you all, or Bayram. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you, Abdullah. I think Professor Ibrahim Kalin doesn't need much more introduction other than to say he's highly respected in the field that he's to speak with us this afternoon. And as I said previously, he not only is a great thinker on this subject, but also puts into action by engaging in meaningful dialogues. He also has the political experience, which is a rare quality. So Ibrahim, if I may, with that, hand over to you and once again, welcome you on behalf of all who are partaking in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank the Center for British Muslim Understanding for their kind invitation, but also congratulate them for launching their important initiative. I hope it will serve as a major platform for understanding between Turkey and Britain, between the larger Turkish and the British communities around the world, because we need understanding more than anything else. The word understanding in the English language, as you know, conveys the meaning of standing under that which you want to grasp, and that requires some sort of a proximity. If you're too far away from your subject of inquiry, you tend to lose the big picture or the intimacy, the connection, to have a deeper understanding of what you're trying to grasp. And I hope the CBTU will serve as an important platform to bring our perceptions, ideas, attitudes closer. And this is where I want to start, actually, because when we discussed the title for this lecture, I was a bit hesitant about using such grandiose word as a civilization at a time when we are dealing with a pandemic, trying to get medical supplies, produce ventilators, helping the needy, the poor, the sick around the world, trying to send these medical supplies to different parts of the world, whether it's the US, Europe, or Africa, and so on and so forth. I thought for a moment, does it make sense to speak in such grand terms at a time of immediate crises such as the one that we are faced with? But I think if you look at, there is a logic or justification for thinking in these terms in the following way, if I may clarify this. We tend to identify or associate civilization, the word civilization, with big structures and buildings and works of art and institutions and systems and the like. I want to use the word civilization in its much narrower sense, in the sense of being civilized and holding together the idea and the attitude of civility. What we see as a work of a civilization, a building, a city, a historical site, and the like, they are really results of these deeper attitudes and perceptions and our relationship with the world of nature and other human beings. Civilizations arise on the basis of these attitudes and principles. And this is where, in fact, in the modern world, we can question whether there are any longer civilizations left in this age of instant communication, consumerism, entertainment culture, unbounded capitalism, profit maximization, crude individualism, and all the other facts of hypermodernity in which we live together. Can we still really talk about such a thing as a civilization? I think in terms of great structures, big mega narratives or meta narratives, as the postmodernists call them, they might be questionable. But the attitude of civility is very much there. If you're going to go back to any notion of civilization, we will have to begin there. And what is civility? Civility is the ability for you to get what you need through reason, virtue, and consensus. The opposite of it is barbarism. It's violence, it's irrationality. If you want something, and I say to meet your needs, not to meet your desires, to get what you want, but rather to meet your needs, basic needs, and that requires some more proper thinking about what your needs are, as opposed to what you want, what your desires are. But basically, civility as an attitude, as a way of connecting to the world of nature, the natural environment, as well as other human beings, entails the idea of acting with reason, virtue, wisdom, and kindness. This is, if you have these qualities and build a human habitat, it's called a city. The civility, the idea is related to civitas, as you know, and that's where all these qualities, in fact, bear their fruit as a collective community. Now, coming to this, to the present moment, where are we with all these notions of civility and barbarity in the 21st century, in year 2020, where we are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and its earth-shattering implications for the global system at the moment. First of all, let me just make a few observations, and then I will end with some conclusions which may help us understand and hopefully better steer ourselves in this chaotic mindset and environment in which we find ourselves today. First of all, the current global order tested positive in face of COVID-19. Its immune system turned out to be much more vulnerable and weaker than many thought. We thought that with all these mighty economies and technologies and military power and institutions of research and development and universities, laboratories, etc., we thought we were invincible. We were not vulnerable. As it turns out, the system actually is much more vulnerable than we thought. It cut across political, social, cultural hierarchies. It didn't recognize any boundaries, east, west, developed, underdeveloped, Chinese, American, Iranian, Italian, Turkish, African. It just cut through the whole spectrum of all the cultural, religious, political, economic hierarchies that we've established over the centuries. Those who responded to the pandemic well actually did it on their own terms. And that raised the very question, the very fundamental question of whether we can deal with pandemics such as these on the basis of our own national abilities and capacities, or we will need to cooperate with others. And that brings us to the idea or the issue of how much national capacity, how much global solidarity and cooperation will be needed to deal with such issues as pandemics, as natural disasters, and the like. I will come to that in a moment, but let me just first underline a point which has been made by some analysts. Some have claimed that nothing will ever be the same again. There seems to be some truth to this. But on the other hand, we have seen many man-made disasters over the last couple of centuries, but especially over the last 50, 60 years. If you go back to the 2 world wars, you can extend this to 100 years or so. We haven't seen humanity as a whole learning the appropriate lessons from these disasters, calamities, pandemics, and the like. So I'm a bit skeptical about the language of nothing will ever be the same again. This is probably a paradigm shift moment in the sense that Thomas Kuhn used the term in his famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But I'm not sure if this is going to lead to a revolution in the widest sense of the term, that is in the sense of us human beings, nations, societies, communities, international institutions, nation states, and others changing their behavior, their way of life in fundamental ways. I don't think we are there yet. It will probably require, and I'm hesitant and also sad to say this, but it will probably require a bigger disaster, a much deeper calamity for us to reckon with all the failing aspects of the current world system or we will need to have a different way of thinking, a much probably a deeper and more profound thinking about the meaning of our lives, why we are here, what are we doing in this world, what are we doing to the world of nature around us, the very nature that we've been destroying for centuries now, and how we are dealing with other human beings, with other communities who are different from us, and so on and so forth. But at any rate, this is not, in my assessment, a moment of revolution yet. Maybe a paradigm shift, because the current paradigm, the system has produced a lot of anomalies. Whether they will lead to a fundamental rethinking of many of the issues at hand, we will see. But whatever we do, whatever decisions we make now, today, as individuals, as communities, as nation states, as countries, as states, as international institutions, everything from the UN to the OIC, from the European Union to the G20 will shape the future of our culture and civilization in the decades to come. My other point is that as we go through this pandemic, international institutions are subjected to serious questioning. How efficient and relevant such institutions as the UN, WHO, European Union, G20, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and others have been throughout this process in terms of helping people in times of urgent need. I think we're all familiar with the debate going on in Europe about the European Union, how it failed as an institution to help the Spanish and the Italians primarily, and then France and the UK and others are affected by this. I can mention NATO solidarity even in this context as well. And the OIC, which has again performed miserably poorly throughout this process, not being able to help mostly poor countries as an institution, unfortunately. I think this process will lead to a further questioning of the legitimacy of international institutions. The third point that I want to make is that I mentioned the fact that the current global order, its immune system turned out to be much more vulnerable and weaker than we thought. This will have serious implications on the so-called global liberal order. But before saying anything about that, I think we have to call a spade a spade. This order has been neither global nor liberal nor an order. Has not been global because has not worked actually to the benefit of all the players and actors around the world, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer as a result of the systematic inequalities and injustices that this current system has been producing for decades. It's a fact. It's not liberal. It's not liberal in the sense of a free flow of commodities or ideas or markets, etc. Those who have power still control the supply lines. It's a fact. Whether you want to sell a commodity, something material, or you want to spread your ideas, your ethical ideas or attitudes, etc., you are up against an enormous structures of power and influence and networking, etc. So it's not liberal really, and it's not been an order either. It's been more of a disorder, chaos, producing more inequality. So whatever we do now as the world community, I think will have serious implications on what has been called the global liberal order. I think what will happen here in terms of globalization and its antithesis, the nationalist backlash, will lead to the rise of three main rivalries or competitive competing groups. The first one will be the globalists. I don't think globalization will just fade away. It will still be there as a fact, and the globalists will continue to defend the idea of globalization as the best way to advance human condition. We will see if that will turn out to be the case or not. Secondly, we will see the internationalists coming to the fore, and they are somewhat different from the globalists Internationalists are those who defend the primacy of the nation state to maintain a certain equilibrium and order on a global scale. So the nation states, as they become now even more powerful today, they will find a bigger and more central place for themselves. They will play a more decisive role in the years to come, because as we speak right now, whether you are a conservative or liberal or Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter. Everybody is turning to public order, public authorities for help, for order, for medical supplies, and so on and so forth. This will certainly strengthen the position of the nation state, the state structures that have come under the eroding impact of globalization for a couple of decades now. I think it will be a time for them to reinvent themselves. And then you will see the rise of neo-nationalist or petty nationalism, where racism, discrimination against the othering of other cultures and communities, self-orientalization, Orientalism, Occidentalism, all these remnants of 19th century and early 20th century modes of thinking will continue to play a role, not only in terms of cultural ideas or trends, but also as serious political movements, as we see the rise of far-right movements and parties and groups in Europe, in the US, and other parts of the world in different forms and shapes. They will fuel, obviously, all the ugly forms of racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other things will probably follow. So we will have to be vigilant against those menaces as we go through this process. The impact on the global economy will obviously be huge. Some economists are already estimating the cost of COVID-19 on the global economy to be anywhere between $3 to $5 trillion. 2020 will probably be a lost year in terms of economic development, and it will take probably several years for both national economies and the global economy to recover from this. My last point, among others, is that three areas will gain further significance, and I think we should take time to think about this. I will just mention them very briefly here, but each needs to be studied in its own right. Biosecurity, cybersecurity, and food security will be of much greater significance for our lives. They are already important, no doubt. Biological agents, biological weapons, biological warfare has been on our agenda for some time. But now, with this pandemic, whether it spread after it was developed at a lab somewhere in the world, in China, Wuhan, or somewhere else, we will never know for sure the truth of all these theories, some of which are obviously conspiracy theories. But the fact is that biosecurity will gain further significance as we go through this process. Cybersecurity will be also even more important, because now we are doing everything online, including the seminar. But more importantly, I mean, billions of transactions are being done over the internet through the online systems, from banking to state communication, from energy supplies to other power lines and everything else, satellite imagery and all of that. So cybersecurity will be even more important. Obviously, it's a comfort, but it also brings a lot of vulnerability, because being connected, being online also means that you're vulnerable actually to all sorts of attacks. Therefore, the issues of cybersecurity, privacy, and all these things will gain further significance. And finally, food security in the widest sense of the term. I don't think it will be the specialty of some organic food lovers anymore. I think we will all have to think about how food is produced, how we access food, and how we consume food. These 2 months have given us a sense of pause. I think, about all the fundamentals of our lives, one of which is certainly this very issue. Thank God we didn't have a global famine or starvation, because there was and there is enough food in the world to feed the almost 7 billion people in the world. But just imagine that a pandemic of this kind to continue for another 6 months, or kind of another biological threat that threatens the very food supply lines. Just imagine how important it will be to have access to food and to healthy food. And I think we will probably spend more time on all of these issues as we go through this difficult times. Now, whether all this will bring us closer to one another or further remove us from one another is another big question. In times of urgent need, obviously, we tend to protect ourselves first before helping others. But as we go through this, it has become clear that no country can deal with this threat on its own. It all requires some degree of international, global, regional cooperation. So there will be room for this kind of international cooperation, global solidarity there. But my sense is that for the short run, probably communities, nations, governments, nation states will tend to focus on their own, on developing their own national capacities and invest in those areas that will strengthen them as individual countries before they look at international institutions such as the UN, the EU, G20, NATO, OIC, ASEAN, or other institutions. This will have obviously some important consequences for our relationship with other cultures and societies. So we have to be vigilant against the even stronger tides of racism and discrimination. And the religious leaders, political leaders, community leaders, individuals, academics, opinion leaders, media people will have to play a role in stemming this new tide of racism and discrimination, which will take the form of what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. It already has taken that form for a long, long time. Unfortunately, racism, old-fashioned discrimination and racism is becoming a part of our lives, is becoming normalized as people become more and more desensitized to this kind of racist attacks through the empowerment of social media, small political groups here and there. But we will all have to be very careful in terms of dealing with this threat as we go through this process. And here, this brings me to the question of national interest. Obviously, each nation will put its national interest first. We have already seen, some countries saying, my country first, etc. That's maybe a natural instinct, especially in times of crisis like this. But it really depends on how narrowly or widely you define your national interest and how you are prepared to defend it. If you define it too narrowly, and then you actually build up walls around you, which tend to make you more vulnerable than protected. Because in this age of globalization, where everything is intertwined, everything has become part of something else, you cannot just do it on your own. Building higher walls doesn't make you safer. It isolates you from the rest of the world for some time, but you cannot live in isolation forever. You need, obviously, connection. You need cooperation. Even if you're talking about technology or anything else, it has become so global, so globally shared, that manufacturing, something even small, simple, requires a lot of interaction, international trade, and so on and so forth. So national interest, I think, will continue to play an important role in our considerations as we go through this process. But the nations, the communities, the countries that define their national interest in a smart way, in a way that allows others also to share in that domain of safety and security, will have a better result at the end of this process in terms of protecting their national interests. My national interest is as much at stake as yours. And my national interest will be protected as long as I acknowledge your national interest as well. And I think selfishness at the individual level leads to a moral vice, but selfishness and hedonism at the international level leads to global disasters. And we've seen many examples of this in our recent history. Therefore, self-sufficiency will be a priority for many nations, but how you define it, how you practice it, will be of extreme significance as we go through this process. Now, let me just end with a couple of points about our connection to civilizational identities. As we go through the social, political, and economic changes, I believe civilizational identities and loyalties will remain significant for people's choices to define how they relate to the world and to the world of nature and to other human communities. Civilizational identities such as the Western civilization or Christian civilization, Islamic, Buddhist, Chinese, African, Latin American, however you want to call them, do play a role in terms of how we identify ourselves with other human beings, whether they're from our societies or from other societies. They don't have to clash with each other. They don't have to be the enemies of each other. Therefore, we don't have to go through the route of Huntington's Clash of Civilizations again. Civilizations in terms of civility, in terms of using your reason, virtue, and wisdom, and love and caring for other people can play an extremely positive role rather than a destructive role, but they need to be acknowledged first of all. I don't think this global liberal utopia where all differences will disappear, all identities and loyalties will just simply evaporate into thin air. It's just an utopia. In the daily lives of ordinary people, from China to Japan, from Africa to Turkey, from Iran to New York, from London or Paris to Sao Paulo or Brazil or Rio or anywhere else, people think in terms of who they are, how they relate to the world, and where they are at this point in history. All these things, I think, make the issues of identity, relating, loyalty, still significant. Therefore, we just have to think about how we can turn civilizational identities and loyalties into a positive force, forces of good rather than evil, destruction, and darkness, rather than creating absolute others, others that become our enemies. We should use this diversity and richness as a source of empowerment. And we can actually have policies of mutual empowerment, where you know, my prosperity, my safety is very much dependent on yours, and vice versa. We can respond to these challenges in some more creative and caring ways. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that the only way to deal with disasters such as this is to, yes, build your own national capacity, but also reach out to the need, to the poor, to make sure that they are also cared for. Otherwise, pandemic, you know, continues to spread from one place to another. And the fact is that every time you give and you help the poor and the needy, in fact, you're helping yourself. You're not doing something as a gesture, you know, to others. Yes, you are being magnanimous, you are being kind, but actually you end up helping yourself. And one last point about how we respond to this. Let's remember the famous British historian Arnold Toynbee, who wrote massively on civilization, and his study of history still remains a valuable work, where he said, or developed the idea of a challenge and response mechanism for each civilization. And he rightly pointed out the fact that a civilization's strength comes not from biological roots or geographical position, but from its ability to deal with challenges and how it responds to those challenges. Therefore, there is nothing innate religiously, ethnically, or racially about any particular culture or society to be superior to others or inferior, but it's just really lies in their ability to respond to challenges that they face in times of crisis. And this is exactly what we're dealing with right now. As a global community, we are faced with a challenge, with a pandemic, with a natural disaster, many parts of which, in fact, are man-made. Now, it really depends on how we respond to this. If you want to be civilized and develop a civilized response to this, what needs to be done is more or less clear. Rather than acting modern-looking, civilized-looking, but continuing barbaric modes of behavior, I think it's time for us to have a reckoning, a soul searching for our own sake, for our own selves, for our own communities, for our own nations, for our own cultures. But we can do this only if we see ourselves as part of a larger reality. Every attempt to place yourself at the center of the universe ends up destroying that universe for everyone. And I think it's time that we have a new list of priorities and have a serious thinking about what is really significant, what is really important, what is really vital in our lives. And we draw the appropriate lessons from this pandemic. And my hope is that down the road, a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, we will be in a better position, having learned the lessons from this disaster. And if you don't do that, the next natural disaster pandemic will be much more deadlier, and we will be much more vulnerable in the face of such calamities. So I want to thank you for listening, and I think I'll maybe stop here, and if you have any questions, we can continue the conversation in that way.
Ibrahim, thank you very, very much indeed for a very rich presentation in which you've raised a number of challenges, but also opportunities. And if I may begin, I love the definition of civilization being essentially acting in a civil way towards the other, the respect and responding to need, and in particular, how you define civility, the need for civility as acting with reason, virtue, and kindness. Now, have we, would you say, seen those three qualities as the dominant qualities in the way in which different leaders have responded to the present challenge?
Thank you, Oliver. It's a very good question. With this definition of being civilized as the foundation of civilization, we go beyond economic development, technological sophistication, military power, and the like. A technologically advanced, economically rich country can be extremely uncivilized, brutal, barbaric, or a very simple rural community somewhere in Australia or in Latin America can be extremely civilized, rational, caring, and loving. So this has nothing to do with your economic power. That's why I said, you know, economic privileges, political hierarchies, even cultural hierarchies have turned out to be shallow and hollow, actually, during this process. Because, to be honest with you, there was a sense of arrogance in some societies when they faced the pandemic in the first place. They said, no, you know, we have efficient health system, we are rich, we have all the means, we will deal with this, don't worry about it, we are going to be just fine. And turned out to be a disaster. You know, over 300,000 people have died to this day from this pandemic. Many of them could have been saved if, in fact, political leaders and others actually acted in those countries with more reason and understanding and precision. Now, in terms of reaching out to those who are in need, yes, there are leaders who believe in this shared humanity and you know, sharing of what you have so that others can also benefit from this. But as I said, individual selfishness is a moral vice. It may lead to some evil. But collective selfishness at the level of nation states, political powers or structures can be much more deadly. And that's where you need, you know, civility injected to be injected into governance, obviously, national governance and international governance to deal with this. Unfortunately, we have seen this over the last 2-3 months, how to name the virus. Is it China virus? Is it this virus? WHO, it's not doing anything. All right, WHO is powerful to the extent to which its members actually give it any power or credibility. Where are the, you know, the scientists, etc.? Some people cry out, all right, the scientists are powerful to the extent to which we actually make them powerful. That is, give them the means to look for a vaccine, to do research and development, etc. Health workers have been extremely heroic during this process, self-sacrificing, really so unselfish. But all of this requires work, a mindset, an attitude that needs to reflect this balance between self-sufficiency and global cooperation on the one hand, but also valuing human life and seeing it as a value in and of itself, regardless of the economic consequences, regardless of the impact of your preventive policies on global markets and the like. I think what is being tested every day, there are COVID-19 tests being done, millions of them every day today. What is being tested is not just our bodies. What is being tested is our reason, our hearts, our consciousness, our sense of humanity. And I think we should remember all this. And if we can learn these lessons from this pandemic, it may lead to some good at the end of the day, but that requires collective work.
Just another question before opening the floor. You know, you talked about the competition between national interest and then the international structures we have at a political level, and we've witnessed that very much in the last couple of months. But alongside that, I have been deeply impressed by how many countries are coming together to advise the medical profession in places like Yemen and Gaza. We've had 2 examples this week where we've had a webinar for doctors to doctors, where Italian, German, Irish, Swedish, Australian, Turkish, Iranian doctors have all come together on the same webinar to give very practical advice to doctors in Gaza, the West Bank, and also Yemen and Libya. Now, could we see a rise actually in civil society cooperation, which transcends the civilizational and national boundaries, because I mean basically the makeup of those doctors were essentially Muslim and Christian, and representing a wide regional geographical area. So could you see this as one of the outcomes of COVID? In fact, because of the failure of leadership at the international level, individuals and smaller organizations are taking the lead in showing the solidarity and the civility that you talked about.
I think there is room for that. It's already happening. Medical professionals are helping each other, talking to one another across the globe. Not only actually during this pandemic, but even before. I mean, I know, and you know from our field work, and because of my work here, official work, that medical doctors from around the world, for example, always go to places, dangerous places where you have refugees, you have wars, you have disasters, just trying to help. And this, I think, has, I mean, Doctors Without Borders and many other institutions like them, for example, have set really a very high moral standard for other professions in terms of helping those in need. And this, I think, with this pandemic, this has become even more relevant. And as this pandemic has made the medical profession even more important and more valuable, I think, in the eyes of the public and also the governments, and hopefully this will benefit the medical workers as well, professionals as well. We will see, I think, more cooperation. There is an opportunity there also, looking at the incredible diversity of the medical professionals, for example, from around the world, men and women, religious, non-religious, believing, non-believing, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, all kinds of people, helping without discrimination. I mean, and this is happening everywhere. This is happening in the US, in Britain, in Turkey, in many other places. Medical professionals doing this unselfish work without discrimination in regards to the ethnicity or social status or religion or faith or political position or ideas of the patients. And this is a remarkable example of how that civility, the concept of civility as an attitude, as a way of being, as a way of relating to other human beings, can help and make a profession a noble enterprise. And I think this is, why can't we think of ways where we can replicate this in other professional areas? Perhaps, I don't know, engineers can think about, forming alliances like this. I don't know, other professionals, teachers, musicians, artists, maybe they can think about how they can, find ways to go beyond this borders and help each other in times of crisis like this one. And I think so. There is a lot of opportunity there, a lot of spaces of opportunity there for other professionals also to think about these issues.
We'll turn, Ibrahim, to some of the written questions, and I'll give Abdul Rahim a chance to come in later. One of the questions is a more philosophical one. What does the coronavirus pandemic reveal about the nature of human beings?
I think it has shown how vulnerable we are, that none of us is invincible, but also no human being is dispensable. And I think we have to keep that in mind. Each human being, each human life is valuable. And we just have to do our best to help them. You cannot, because we've seen reports to the effect that in some places doctors were forced to make choices between patients. Okay, I'm going to take you, but not you because you're too old, you're too ill, or something like that. Obviously, this is not acceptable from a purely human point of view. Our innate strength actually comes from our ability to acknowledge our vulnerabilities. We are vulnerable human beings. We are very fragile, and our strength comes from acknowledging that and dealing with this fact. And this invisible virus, this biological agent, has brought the entire world system to its knees, and we are all now going through a very different, interesting stage in our lives while we're trying, to do the best out of it. But the fact is that we are all vulnerable. The systems that we have established are vulnerable. They are very fragile. That, I think, should give us pause for serious thinking. And we also have to understand, again, it's a cliche, but many cliches also tell the truth. No man is an island. That is true. And we are not islands. We are connected to one another in ways that may not be perceptible or clear or visible at first sight. But I think we have seen during this pandemic that yes, you want to take care of your own first. You want to have self-sufficiency based on your own national capabilities. But we also all know at the end of the day, we cannot do this on our own. No country is able to deal with such pandemics on its own, and nor should they. In fact, we should increase cooperation in that area. And I say this all the time, and I want to repeat again because it's really significant. And I think this pandemic has once again shown that none of us is safe until all of us are safe. Yeah. I don't think anyone claim immunity from such disasters, man-made disasters, natural pandemics, epidemics, or terrorism, or other disasters. No one can claim immunity. We all have to understand that if I want to be safe, I have to make sure that you are safe too.
Ibrahim, you touched on the rise of nationalism, and here today on news in Britain, it was talking about how large number of people believe the virus is caused, leaving aside China and the obvious, but talking about it being a Jewish or a Muslim virus that is being imposed on us. Now, one of the Akmal has asked, what are the top 3 things that are required to be done by governments to reduce hate speech, and that is leading to clashes rather than cooperation at this time?
Yes, I read some reports which were very disturbing. For example, in India, some Hindu nationalists blame the virus on Muslims of India, fueling further religious ethnic tensions there. In the US, we have seen this debate about whether to call it the China virus, Wuhan virus, etc., trying to turn this into a political profit point. I think political leaders need to be extremely careful and take political leadership seriously, especially in times of crisis like this. Governments, first of all, put out all the facts out there. What is being done, what is happening objectively, so that they can put aside all these conspiracy theories. Secondly, they should avoid any kind of blame game. We are in the thick of this crisis still. It looks like, it's kind of going down. The first wave is going down in many countries, but there is no guarantee that it will not come back. So we have to be careful and vigilant here. And this is no time for a blame game. You did this, you did that. Who produced this? You didn't close your border. I think we will all be vulnerable if we get into that kind of a fight at this point. And number 3, there must be a concerted effort by all governments, opinion leaders, religious leaders, community leaders, and others to talk to one another, to console those who are stressed out because of this and that, for various reasons, obviously, and have a conversation about the human condition and acknowledge our vulnerability and not try to gain political points for the short term, but rather see the larger picture here, that we are all interconnected. We all will go out of this crisis if we stand together and understand the political consequences if they make mistakes, the consequences will not be limited just today to that particular country. It will have impact globally.
Thank you. Abdul Rahim is with us now, and Abdul Rahim is the chairman of the AK party here in Britain. Abdul Rahim, your question, please.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you, Abdullah Falik and the CBTU team for organizing today's excellent webinar. It is of significant interest to many of us. We commend CBTU for the launch of the project, and I'm really delighted that our distinguished Professor Ibrahim Kalin could join us in this webinar today. Professor Ibrahim, you are a breath of fresh air for Turkey and beyond. This is because you have relentlessly been working for peace, justice, and understanding. And you've been doing this for a very long time. My question to you is a simple one. Do you think efforts like yours and others in promoting dialogue is actually producing results? Thank you.
Thank you, Abdurrahim. No, it is actually producing results. I don't want to self-promote here, not myself, but my country. But I think Turkey deserves a lot of credit for what it has done during this pandemic also. You know, we are the first country to send medical supplies and ventilators to Africa, to Somalia, at a time when you know, everybody was looking frantically for ventilators, and we produce our own ventilators here based on our national engineering companies, and they did an excellent job. And the first thing we did was really to send, and that's really our president's visionary leadership, but also his sense of you know, moral duty, that he ordered us to send ventilators to Somalia. We don't know what will happen in Africa. I'm following the developments in Africa closely, but with also a lot of concern. God forbid, you know, if it spreads there in the way it did in China or in Europe, you can imagine the consequences. I mean, given the lack of medical infrastructure, hospitals and doctors and medical supplies, etc., we will see an incredible human suffering, which we hope will not happen. So we have sent, in fact, just this morning, I was trying to coordinate the sending of medical supplies to Niger and Chad, again, some of the poorest countries in Africa. So I think, you know, this kind of work, trying to reach out to those in need, does certainly pay off in the sense that I know how people in Somalia feel, not only towards Turkey, but also anyone who helps them. But I know that Turkey has a special place in their heart because of our president's work in Somalia. It was actually exactly 10 years ago, 2010, and it was also during the month of Ramadan, just happened, that we took our first trip to Somalia when the famine led to the death of hundreds of thousands, or over 300,000 people's death in Somalia at that time. And nobody knew anything about Somalia. Nobody cared about Somalia. I've seen things that should never happen, you know, to a human being. I've seen a mother who told us that she had to make a choice between two of her children, to leave one and to take the other one with her, because it was a long journey, almost 400-kilometer journey, you know, in the burning desert and heat of Somalia, coming to Mogadishu. What do you do? I mean, you just don't. You cannot just simply see this and do nothing. You know, you have to do something. In fact, the difference between knowledge and wisdom is that, you know, knowledge is something that is in your mind, fine, but wisdom is knowledge combined with action, with moral action. You just have to do something about it, to correct it. It's not enough to get statistics of you know, children dying of malnutrition. That statistics doesn't do me any good until and unless, you know, I act to stop their killing. And that's where, you know, wisdom becomes part of your political action, your moral thinking, consciousness. We see this, I think, in other areas also. I mean, we've provided medical supplies at the time, again, it was in dire need, to our NATO allies, to Spain and Italy. We send medical supplies to the UK. Some people try to create some kind of a confusion there, trying to damage or discredit that beautiful success story between Turkey and the UK. And the facts came out, obviously, later very clearly, and everybody realized that has nothing to do between the two governments, and it's only a small fraction of the medical supplies that had problems. The British government thanked the Turkish government, you know, on this. But this kind of cooperation is definitely needed. And I know it, you know, touches the minds and hearts of many, many, many people. We tend to talk about, you know, the bad news because, as they say in the media, if it bleeds, it leads. You know, bad news is always more attractive. If nothing happens on the Bosphorus today, God forbid, no, you know, ship accident, it's not news. But it's a wonderful news that there was no accident, you know, in the Bosphorus today, right? But it never gets registered as newsworthy. It's newsworthy when there is an accident, something happens, God forbid, somebody dies. But the fact is that we have to focus on what is good, you know, what is beautiful also in our lives, but especially in times like this. You may not be, like us, the richest country in the world. You may not have the most sophisticated technologies in the world. You may not have the mightiest armies in the world, but you still can help. You share what you have, and that's the biggest reward.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. There are a couple of questions, written questions, I want to combine. The first is, Iftar says, with governments bailing out companies and paying salaries of many citizens, do you see a rise in socialism of some form as the predominant economic order of the future? And also one relating to Turkey and the EU. Do you think the assistance provided by Turkey will help the process towards either full membership of the EU, or will it bring you closer and facilitate visas, etc.?
Socialism may have a chance as an idea, but I'm not sure it will really have a chance in terms of solving the practical problems of millions of people across the world. Slobodan Zizek recently claimed that, in fact, this is a socialist moment in the sense that now, you know, public order and authority and shared responsibility, you know, must come into play. Well, you know, given the realities of the world and the dismal record of the so-called socialist and communist countries in the past, I'm not sure if that idea will really fly. But the idea of public order and security gaining more prominence versus, say, more freedom or more liberal, unregulated areas of the global order. Yes, I think there is a space for that. There is a chance for that. But you know, history has its own checks and balances. I think it will also lead to some kind of a antithesis as you go for, you know, more and more, say, loosening of borders and irregularity, etc. It will certainly lead to calls for more regulation of the global system. So I think we will see a hybrid system of more emphasis on safety and security on the one hand, but also a kind of an underlying deeper demand for freedom at the same time. This all the tension between the two, I think, will continue in the post-corona world. As far as Turkey and the EU is concerned, there is certainly room for further cooperation between Turkey and the EU. We've been trying to become a full member, as you know, since 2005, and our president made the most effort in recent memory of all the Turkish political leaders and bringing Turkey and the EU closer and bringing Turkey to EU membership much closer. But unfortunately, for a number of reasons into which I cannot go now, that process has rather stalled. We have not been able to make much more progress. But I think the refugee crisis coming out of Syria, but also Afghanistan, Iran, and Libya partly, and then this pandemic and a number of other developments are forcing Turkey and the EU to have closer cooperation. And we are very much hopeful that with the German presidency in the EU in the second half of 2020, we may have a chance to address some issues, revise and update the March 18, 2015 Turkey-EU migration deal, bring our differences closer to one another, address issues, whether they're in the Aegean or Eastern Mediterranean or the refugees or Syria or Libya. I think there is a lot of room for improvement or for us to be hopeful for the second half of 2020 under the German presidency in the EU. But Turkey is ready to cooperate. But let me also say that it takes two to tango. We have to see some action from the European side, from the EU side also to address these issues, because it's in EU's interest to have Turkey as a full member, as a strong ally and partner, as we are partners and allies in NATO. It's also in Turkey's interest to be part of the larger European security and economic architecture. That's why Turkey has opted to become and applied and began the process of becoming a full member in the EU. And I hope some countries in the EU will put aside their short-term agendas and interests and see the larger picture in which Turkey and the EU can work together much more efficiently than they have been so far.
Well, can I turn to another written question, Ibrahim? Can Russia and Iran be guarantors in Syria, I presume, of peace and future there? That's a rather big question given the time we have, but would you like to comment on that while we wait for Isa?
Yeah, sure. Very briefly, we've been working with Russia and Iran in the Astana process to end the fighting in Syria, and the Astana process has worked so far, reduce violence there. Most recently, we have reached an agreement with Russia back in March, I think it was March 5th, for a ceasefire in Idlib, and the ceasefire is holding. And I'm glad we had this deal with the Russians on the Idlib ceasefire just before the outbreak of the pandemic. You know, if we had fighting continue in Idlib and more people becoming internally displaced or refugees, you can imagine the consequences, you know, given the pandemic, you know, people moving in their hundreds and thousands of people. So that turned out to be actually a blessing that we had this ceasefire agreement just before the pandemic. Now, we have our own differences with Russia and Iran over the future of the Assad regime, particularly Bashar al-Assad. We don't think he is the leader, he is the political figure to unite Syria after what he has done to his own country. But we understand the realities on the ground. That's why we want to bring the Astana process closer to the Geneva process and reach a political settlement under the UN Resolution 2254, where a constitutional committee is now working to write a new constitution or revise the existing constitution. Then we can go for an interim government and then elections, free and fair elections in Syria. It's not impossible if we have political will from all countries. The problem in Syria is that the main stakeholders are only looking after their own selfish interests. Nobody is really looking at Syria as a whole and taking care of the Syrian people, but rather, you know, some countries are interested in maintaining their military bases there. some are interested in controlling oil fields, some are interested in making more political inroads, and so on and so forth. Those small agendas, if I may call them, petty agendas, are becoming increasingly an obstacle to finding a lasting, sustainable solution to the Syrian conflict. But we will continue to work with Iran and Russia, as well as with our Western allies. We are working, with the Americans, with the British, with others, with the UN, certainly with the Germans, to help to work in different. We are working in different capacities, obviously, because we have our own differences with the Americans about the PYD, YPG, because they've been following this wrong-headed policy from the very beginning, supporting the Syrian branch of the PKK, which we can never accept because it's a terrorist organization. But in terms of helping the refugees, trying to find a political settlement and reaching an agreement in ceasefire for a safe zone, and hopefully finding a political solution under the UN mandate, we will continue to work with different partners.
Can I then put this question on from Jordan on a vaccine? He says, the vaccine is the only way to truly overcome this crisis. How do we ensure that the quest for a vaccine does not become a victim of my country first nationalism, as governments and private cooperations surge forward to become the first to develop it? Instead, how do we best create an environment for genuine cooperation?
Well, excellent question. This is the very question that our president raised about 3 weeks ago when he joined the EU initiative to find a vaccine to raise funds. The EU has began this initiative and they raised, I think, about 7.5 billion euros or dollars for research on vaccine against coronavirus or COVID-19. So we are part of that process. So we are happy that the money is needed have been raised. That's good. But we also want to make sure, as Baran pointed out, that it's globally accessible. It is available to everyone, and it is done in a very transparent way. The research, the financing of it, the tests and everything are done in a fair and transparent way, so that all the different stakeholders and participants can be part of the process. Once the vaccine is produced, and I agree, I think the key thing right now is to produce this vaccine, to make it a globally accessible, available cure for everyone. And it should be available at a very low cost, and if possible, in fact, without any price, at least for those who cannot afford, in millions or so, etc. So the way we approach this is exactly to make sure that we work on vaccine and we make it available to everyone, and no country claims any privilege over either the research or finding or the use of the vaccine once we have it.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I think, in fairness to you, we should, we're very grateful for your time. We know that your many demands on your time, and I think we need to bring the webinar to a close. As I said, you presented us with challenges and also opportunities, insights. We've had many questions written and a few requests to intervene in the discussion, but unfortunately time just doesn't allow it. I'd like to thank you very sincerely for giving us the stimulation today to work together to create understanding between our civilizations, rather than the tensions that we have witnessed in recent years. And you, as I say, embody what you spoke about. I've worked with you for the last 12 years quite closely, and really have come to value and appreciate your commitment, and that these were not just academic words, but they reflect what you personally have stood for over a number of years, and we are sincerely grateful to you for this presentation. I'd also like to thank our hosts, the Centre for British-Turkish Understanding. It's a new institution set up by the AK Party, and I think a very important one, because it gives us that opportunity to really enter into a dialogue, a much needed dialogue at the present time, and to look at ways that we can work together to promote the understanding we spoke about, the need for which we spoke about this afternoon. Just very briefly, you can visit the website. It's cbtu.org.uk. And finally, may I wish everyone, first of all, apologize if your question wasn't asked or you didn't have an opportunity, but please do keep in touch. Someone asked, could they have the recording of this presentation and discussion emailed to them, and I'm sure that will be possible. But may we conclude by wishing everyone who took part this today a very blessed Eid, and we were at one with you in the celebration of Eid. Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Thank you, CBTU.
Thank you, Oliver. And I want to thank again Center for British-Turkish Understanding for their kind invitation, and I wish them the best of success with this new initiative, new beginning, new hope. And I want to say Eid Mubarak, Bayram Mubarak to all Muslims. And here, let's hope that these last 2 days of Ramadan and the Eid celebrations bring us a fresh air of hope, reason, virtue, and grace. Thank you.
Thank you.